Hi class, welcome to your first lecture for Bio 101, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology. You can see the picture of our textbook here. Hopefully you have the textbook at this point, and you've already read through chapter 1, and you've done some of the homeworks, the activities, and things like that. This is the way we'll do lectures this semester. You'll see my face here on the side, and then you'll have the PowerPoint here in the middle as we're going through the different information. Try to make it pretty exciting, try to make it not boring, and keep you awake as we go through and make the videos not too long so that you can move between the different videos for the information that you need. So first chapter, here we go. Let's start into just the basics here. We're going to be talking about, started with the organization. So in order to understand anatomy and physiology and everything that goes into this field, you have to have a foundation, you have to have a basic knowledge. And so that's what this first chapter is going to talk about. We're going to set the stage so that as we go through the rest of the semester, we'll have that foundation. We'll know what we are referring to as we use different terms and as we look at different figures and things like that. So the first thing to understand, though, is what is anatomy and what is physiology. You've probably heard these words. I know you've heard these words because it's in the title of this class, but have you ever had to define these words before? So anatomy, when we're talking about anatomy, we're talking about the structure of things. And how those structures relate to other things. So if I was to say, what is the anatomy, what are some different examples of anatomy of the body? So our bone structure, that's anatomy. So if we're naming bones, we say, okay, here's our, let's get in the picture here. Here are our phalanges, here are our carpals, we've got our radius and ulna, and our humerus up here in the picture. So those are anatomical structures. We're talking about any different part of the body. So anatomy is all about the structure of things. Physiology is about function, how those structures function, how they work together. So digestion is a physiological function. We're going to talk a little bit later about homeostasis. That's about physiology. Any of the functions of our body, the production of urine, the blood moving through our body, the pH of the blood, that's physiology. So the function of these structures, that's the physiology. So these two things work in conjunction with each other. So you have structures, and then we have the function of those structures. That's anatomy and physiology. And something to remember here, so the structure of a part of the body suits the function of that part. So we can learn a lot about the function of something by its shape. So, for example, the esophagus is a long tube. Its function, so we could talk about the anatomy of the esophagus, the different layers, and the muscles and different things like that. And then we can look at the physiology, the function. So its function is to move food from the mouth to the stomach. And its structure, its anatomy, is suited to that function. All right, so let's move on now. Let's talk about the organization. Another important foundational bit of knowledge is that our body is organized into what we call hierarchical levels. In other words, each level builds on the next to get eventually to the whole organism. Now this is true throughout biology, not just in anatomy and physiology. We see this organization throughout all different types of life, but all life doesn't necessarily have all of these different parts. When we're talking about anatomy and physiology, we have all of these different levels. Many of these you're already familiar with. The organism, that's the whole individual. And we as individuals, our whole being is made up of what we call organ systems. And that's what we're going to be focusing as we go throughout this class. We're going to be looking at each organ system individually as we move through the semester. So for example, we have the respiratory system. It's made up of our lungs and the tubes and things that take the air into our lungs. We have our cardiovascular system, which is our heart and all the vessels that move that blood around our body. So those are organ systems. Organ systems are made up of organs, individual organs. So for example, the heart is an organ in the cardiovascular system. And then organs are made up of tissues. So we can take the heart as an organ and we can look at the different tissues that make that organ, that make the heart. And we'll talk about the different types of tissues a little bit later. But there are a few main types of tissues that all of our organs are made up of. If we take tissues, tissues are a tissue. The definition of a tissue is a group of cells that have a similar function. And so tissues are made up of cells. Cells are the basic unit of life. All living things are made of cells. And then those cells, though, if we break them down even further, they're made up of chemicals. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about chemistry, organic molecules, and even smaller atoms and things like that that make up these different structures that then are put together in the cellular level. So everything on Earth is made up of chemicals. We can take those chemicals and we can join them together in certain ways to make cells. And when we join those chemicals together to make cells, that becomes a living thing. We then take these cells and we have groups of cells that form tissues. They have the same function. They're working together. We call this a tissue. We take tissues and we form them together, and we have organs. And organs make up organ systems within the organism as a whole. So you can see how these levels of organization build on each other. And it's important to know these levels, and the order is important. So it's important. So you need to know this order. You can't move. So cells do make up organs, but cells first make up tissues, which make up organs. So you need to know these levels. This is a picture of the different levels. So starting with the atoms, atoms come together to form molecules. Molecules form bigger things called macromolecules. So this is all chemical here. And then chemical comes together to form organelles. Organelles form cells. Again, cells, this is the basic unit of living things. Cells form tissues. Tissues form organs. Organs form organ systems. And then we have the full organism. There we are. So we've got all the different parts. Okay, next thing that's really important when we're building this foundation is what we call anatomical terms. Now, when we're learning anatomy and physiology, we want to make this the same across all different textbooks. All doctors want to be, when they're saying a word, they want somebody else to understand what they're saying. So what they've done is they've come up with what we call anatomical terms, which are names of different parts of the body, and everybody uses these same terms. So you'll need to learn these anatomical terms. You'll be taking a quiz on the anatomical terms. Okay, so they're used to describe the location of body parts, also regions of the body, and also planes that are cut through the body. And all of these are based on what we call anatomical position. This is very important because when we're using these terms, we are assuming that we're referring to these terms in anatomical position. I think it's kind of a funny little picture, but this is the one from your book, and this shows someone in anatomical position. Notice how they're facing forward, their palms are facing forward as well, and their arms are down at their side, their feet are facing forward. This is anatomical position. So all of the terms that we learn are based on this picture that you see here. So when somebody is in anatomical position, this is what they're doing. Now, as I mentioned, you're going to have a quiz on the anatomical terms. If we navigate over to Blackboard, then you will see so where I am in the lesson materials, and I'm in chapter 1 materials, and there's something called a quiz 1 required terms, and this is what that looks like. These are the anatomical terms that we would like you to memorize and learn for a quiz that you're going to be taking. So notice that there are some directional terms. We're going to look at these. Planes of the body, and then body regions. All the rest of these are body regions. So I want you to learn these. So I'm going to point these out, not right now. I'm going to make a separate video just of these anatomical terms and be able to point them out for you so that you can learn them. But for now, we're going to finish up talking about some of these things here. So that's anatomical position. You can see it there. Okay, I want to talk about body cavities and membranes, and then we'll end this video. And then I'll make another video about the anatomical terms. Okay, so body cavities and membranes. This is another foundational topic here. So we have different body parts of the body. The first one that we want to talk about is called a posterior body cavity. Now, posterior is an anatomical term. It's also the same as dorsal. So dorsal and posterior mean the exact same thing. Now, the dorsal body cavity is basically the body cavity in the back. Dorsal posterior means the back. And this includes the cranial cavity, which is your head, your brain, and then the vertebral canal going down the back, going down your back. And within this cavity, we have things called meninges. And we'll see this a lot later in the class when we talk about the nervous system. But these are membranes that surround the brain and the spinal cord, and they have cerebrospinal fluid, which helps to cushion and protect and nourish the brain and spinal cord. So that's the dorsal body cavity. Then the second body cavity we have is the anterior or the ventral body cavity. So again, these mean the same thing, anterior and ventral. And this includes the thoracic cavity, which is the upper cavity. This is your rib cage area. And then we have the abdominopelvic cavity, and that's the lower part. And the diaphragm, which is what helps you breathe in and out, that separates the thoracic cavity on top and the abdominopelvic cavity below. Now within the thoracic cavity, we have the mediastinum and the right and left pleural cavities. And we're going to look at that in just a minute. And then in the abdominopelvic cavity, we have the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. And so this word is just the joining of those two types of cavities. So in order to understand what's in these cavities, we have to understand something called the serous membranes. Now, our organs in the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity are surrounded by what are called serous membranes. And these secrete serous fluid. And this is basically just so that our organs, as they're moving, so for example, our heart is pumping all day long. So it's creating friction. Or would be creating friction if we didn't have these serous membranes. It would be bumping into our lungs, and then our digestive cavities, as our digestive organs are digesting the food that we're eating, they're kind of moving around, and they'd be moving and scraping against each other if we didn't have these serous membranes. So what these serous membranes do is they surround the organs, and the serous fluid in between them reduces friction. So around all of our organs, we have two serous membranes. We have what's called the parietal membrane and a visceral membrane. Let's start with the visceral. The visceral membrane is in contact with the organ. So for example, around the heart, we have a visceral membrane, and then we have a parietal membrane, which is in contact with the cavity. And the way to think about this is the example we always use, and I use this in the book as well. Think about if you took your fist. Let's say that you had a balloon, and you took your fist, and the balloon was blown up, and you were to shove your fist into that balloon. What you'd end up with is something like this. You'd end up with two layers around your fist, or in this case the lungs, because you punched it into that balloon. So you'd have the layer right against your fist, and that is the same as the visceral membrane. And then you'd have a layer around, which is the outside of the balloon, and that is the parietal membrane. And in between those two layers, in the balloon you'd have air, but in the body, in between the visceral and the parietal membranes, we have the serous fluid, which again is to create or reduce friction with these with the organs, with the membranes there. Now we have three types of serous membranes that I want to talk about. One is the pleural membrane, then we have the pericardium, and then we have the peritoneum. Now the pleural membrane, this is around the lungs. So we have the parietal pleural membrane, and we have the visceral pleural membrane. The parietal is around the outside of our rib cage, and then the visceral pleural membrane is right along in contact with the lungs. The pericardium is the same, except it's with the heart. So we have two membranes around the heart. We have the parietal and we have the visceral. The visceral is right against the heart, and the parietal is around, is in contact with the cavity. It's the second membrane around the heart. Then we have the peritoneum, which is the same thing, but it's in our abdominal cavity, abdominal pelvic cavity, and it's surrounding the organs of digestion. Okay, so those are the different types of membranes, the serous membranes. So here's a picture showing the different cavities, and then also it talks about the pleural membranes. It also mentions the mediastinum that I kind of passed over. So we'll look at that as well. So here is the dorsal cavity here, which is the brain and spinal cord. And here is the anterior cavity. And that has the thoracic cavity and then the abdominal pelvic cavity here. And then if you look at a front view, you can see the different pleural membranes. So we have the serous membranes. We have the pleural membranes here around the lungs, and we have the parietal and the visceral. The visceral would be right up against the lungs. And then we have the heart, which is a pericardium. You can see the parietal pericardium here. Then the visceral will be right around the heart. Now this area here in the middle is considered the mediastinum, and it contains the heart and some other structures, the esophagus and the thymus gland just above the heart, right in the middle. So think of middle when you think of mediastinum. It's right in the middle of the body here. And then we have the left and right pleural cavities here. And then down below in the abdominal pelvic cavity, we have the parietal peritoneum, and then you have the visceral peritoneum right around the organs. Okay, the last thing that we're going to look at here in this section is what we call the quadrants. So what we can do is when we were talking about different parts of the body, we can divide it up so that we know where we're talking about. So there's different ways to divide it. Your book talks about a few different ways. We're just going to use the 4 quadrant method. And the way this method is if you were just to take your body and in the forward-facing view and just draw an X or a plus sign, I guess, right down through the middle, you end up with 4 quadrants. The right upper quadrant, the left upper quadrant, the right lower, and the left lower. Now, remember that this is based on anatomical position. So when we say right upper quadrant, it's not you're right looking at somebody else, it's you're right on your own body. So you got your right arm here. Here's my right arm. So my right upper quadrant would be on my right side of my body, right lower quadrant on the right side. And then the left side would have the left upper and the left lower quadrant. And you can see that there are different organs that are found in each of these quadrants. So our liver is found in the right upper quadrant. Our stomach is mostly in the left upper quadrant, but moves over into the right a little bit. Then we have our intestines and things like that. So again, it helps us know what we're talking about and where we're talking about it based on these different quadrants. Okay, so that's where we're going to end this little portion. I have some more videos about other parts of this chapter as well.